Thank you so much, PattiSue, for being willing to tape for a second time to just finish up with some questions I really wanted to hit yesterday when we did session one, and I'm very, very grateful. We're doing this on the 21st of July, and subject to some editing and PattiSue's approval, this should be published by early August, and the Olympic Games will have come and gone. I just got to start out by saying we're going to talk to you about doping to begin with, doping in the 80s and the 90s when you ran, and anything beyond that you want to comment on. But I've just got to say, in watching you in some of the uploaded races, the national and international races, it occurred to me, did you ever think about cutting off your pigtail?
A little bit. Every now and then I would think about it. I mean, I still have kind of a lot of hair, and if the nice thing about having it long is you don't have to think about it. You just basically put it in the braids and it's taken care of. Whereas if I had it short, I would have had to like actually take care of it and keep getting it cut and things like that. So there's like a simplicity to it, and I know it bothered people. So I have to say that um, it it's not why I did it, but it certainly was a good a nice little side benefit to it. I mean, people would joke about having wanting to grab my hair and hold me back, but mostly it was just the way I'd done it and the way I'd always done it. And yeah, I mean, there were moments where I thought I would weigh about 2 pounds less if I cut my hair.
Honestly, you took my,
But
that's my line. I saw you
yeah,
in enough races here. It suddenly dawned on me that thing was
yeah,
huge. And
yeah, it was
that
a
was
lot of
worth two
hair.
tenths of a second, I think, if you took it
Maybe,
off.
maybe. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I did eventually cut my hair and I didn't run any faster. So, but yeah, it was, and then I wouldn't say again, there were no, I never did anything for this particular reason. It wasn't how I kind of came up in the sport, but it certainly was an identifying factor. I think like the meet directors would have been unhappy if I cut my hair short, like so many other people.
You had the
So
wraparounds and the pigtail, and that
yeah,
was like your signature. That was
yeah,
PattiSue, and it was fun.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
And I loved wearing sunglasses. I mean, that was something that I did because it was beneficial to me. And then it became financially beneficial to me as well. But I started with it just because with the bright lights and, I have the blue eyes and I was out in the sun a lot and
yeah,
I have really bad allergies. So it was really just something that I started doing because it made sense. And then it made sense.
became something
So
more. Yeah,
yeah,
to the
yeah,
manufacturer. Well, with all joking aside, then let's talk a little bit about doping and
yeah,
how prevalent that really was with hindsight in the 80s and
yeah, yeah.
90s. What are your reflections off the top of your head about that?
I mean, it was obviously very prevalent. I mean, the Eastern Europe, I mean, it's hard to really understand how closed off that part of the world was to people today. I mean, we had no contact with Eastern Europeans outside a few um, little interactions that we might have at a track. I mean, if you competed against East Germans, if you competed against Soviets, they were, in separate hotels, separate floors. They would have, I mean, their coaches, no joke, were KGB agents. You know, so I mean, there was really, and we could spend a whole broadcast talking about what it was like to interact with the athletes when you did. I mean, there were some super scary stuff that happened and super like just right out of like a James Bond movie kind of thing. Um, so, but that also meant that nobody else was going in there. You couldn't do surprise drug testing in the Soviet Union. You just didn't, land in Moscow and go find athletes and test them. So, I mean, even with the limited amount of testing that was going on, there was none going on inside, the Eastern Bloc. There was zero. I mean, zero unannounced, surprise, random testing. Now they had their own system set in place, and they would never test positive because their athletes wouldn't have been allowed out of, they would just not been named to a team if they had tested positive, and it would have been a mistake. In other words, they were doping, but it was planned doping. And I mean, once the wall fell down, and particularly like East Germany. They kept super detailed records about all the doping that they did. So it's not made up. It's not fantasy. I mean, it's all a lot of it is you can document it. Some of it you can't because the Russians are still the Russians, and they are not our friends.
And what could that be worth to a mile runner in seconds? Do you think the power of the most potent doping stuff? How many seconds might someone take off of a mile time? It's just
Yeah,
speculation, but
I have no idea. But I
we're not
mean,
talking tenths of a second. We're talking.
no, no. I mean, we're talking like times are still relevant that were set. I mean, in the last 3 or 4 years, finally those records are starting to be erased permanently, but it's taken 50 years, 40, 50 years of a lot of racing and a lot of countries that weren't even countries, honestly, like they didn't even exist. I mean, not only were quote unquote the Soviets breaking these records and the Eastern Germans breaking these records, but for the most part, they were doing it with one country. They didn't have, like now there's a lot of little countries that have sort of come, Lithuania is a country now, Latvia is a country now, Georgia is a country now, Kazakhstan, how do you even say it? I mean, the stand countries, they exist now. So they would put their best people and spend 4 years. I mean, when I first started, there really wasn't a professional running circuit. I mean, there was certainly athletes getting paid under the table, but it was still quote unquote an amateur. And you would be suspended, or you would be, not allowed to compete in international competition like as it represent the U.S. or represent your country in international competition if you had been found to have accepted money to compete. And again, there's a whole conversation about that and what that meant and who it meant who couldn't compete, who couldn't do this, particularly in the US if you weren't getting paid, right? Like how could you? Only rich people, right? Could do this if they weren't getting paid. But that was not the case. And of course it was incentivized by a lot of different political forces, but the Soviets or the communists were very happy with this program because they could go and dope for 3 years and then make sure their athletes were clean and then come out and destroy everybody, and it made their system look great. But they weren't trying to, they were the ultimate professionals, right? I mean, they were plucked from whatever village, whatever place they lived, sent to schools just for sport, trained just to do this one thing. Their bodies, I mean, most of the women that I competed against, if I can track them down at all, they're no longer alive. I mean, they died pretty young.
Because of the side effects of so many chemicals being.
I would presume that to be the case.
I always wondered about that. And the flip side of I thought that when we were talking yesterday, you made a good point talking about Ben Johnson. Here's a person who originally immigrates from Haiti to Canada. He doesn't have an alternative vocation, outside of running. He's not a professional or
right.
Accountant or a doctor, or so his meal ticket, even in amateur sports times, is running and what he can gain in terms of monetizing his running skill.
Right.
And so in a sense, someone says the best way to do it is to dope. For someone that doesn't have a lot of other options, it's you can't judge everybody.
Yeah, it's easy to judge. I mean, the women that I met, for the most part, when the wall started to come down and we were able to have more interaction with the Eastern European athletes, that were, I mean, genuinely lovely people. I mean, but they had no choice. And I mean, often they would have, if you asked them if they were doping, they would have said no. They weren't in control of anything. And even some of the coaches and athletes today, like if you're with a certain coach, and they tell you to take vitamin D because it's good for your bones and they're giving you vitamin D, you're not probably going to question it. You're going to assume that you're getting vitamin D from your coach, and you may or may not be. But that's, so I think at this point, particularly as professional athletes get older, I would assume that but I mean, I don't presume to know anything, honestly. I know what happened then, and I guess I know what's happening now, but you know, it's
Yeah.
it's certainly not as easy anymore to do it. But if there's plenty of Netflix documentaries on doping that ring pretty true, and it's certainly. I mean, I think it's there's still enough money and enough prestige, and countries want it, and they'll do things at the expense of the individual athlete. I mean, if you just look at sort of the political philosophies of some of these, many countries, it's all about, the individual is not important. I mean, in the US, we're all about the individual, but in a lot of nation states, it's, the individual is very secondary to the state.
Yeah, certainly major thoughts like nationalism. Nationalism is not about the individual. It's everything for the glory of the state, for the nation,
Yeah,
whether
yeah,
you're far right or far left.
yeah,
Nationalism is about the country being the one that is
yeah,
lifted up and glorified. So the individual is expendable to some
yeah,
degree, whether it's a war, an actual war, or
yeah,
a political war, which the Olympics
yeah,
became. In doing my research, interesting. I didn't know this. Maybe you did, but the Soviet Union, after the Second World War, opted out of the 48 games. They didn't come to London in 1948.
yeah,
But sometime after that, the light went on. In the reading that I was doing, they realized, hey, these Olympics are a tremendous platform
yeah,
for politics, for political gain. And
yeah,
so that's when the funding started in the 50s. And in turn, I was reading the US. That's when the US began to open up the gates to the Black athlete, to Black men and women, because they realized the stakes were becoming elevated because they knew that the Soviets were now sponsoring their
yeah.
athletes. And so they had to raise the bar by letting more people in.
Right. This is true. I mean, the Soviets also lost like 20 million people in World War II, 20 million young men. So they weren't they weren't probably prepared in any sense in 1948, whether they saw they're not going to bring a bad team. They will bring nobody versus bringing a bad team.
That's a
Um,
good point.
yeah. And I mean, yes, we did, but we still had people fighting, internally against, for amateurism and what that meant. And again, from a socio-political perspective, that eliminated a lot of people that could have potentially been great athletes for us.
Yeah,
But
that
yeah,
that's
so
going to
I
be
mean, yeah, I would
another.
say like, yeah, that's a whole other, can of worms. There's books been written on that, and we could probably explore a lot. Um, and and it's unfortunate that as collectively as a country we tend to have short memories, but it was hardly even playing field even when I started. And um I think really one of the long-term benefits, short-term, very short-term negative, I mean, it's very negative in the short term and maybe for other reasons in the long term, but the boycott in 1980, I think led to some athletes staying in the sport for another 4 years. And there was reasons to keep them in. I mean, almost before there was almost all college athletes, right? I mean, again, for the same reasons. If someone wasn't paying your room and board, how are you going to do this? And so, and then because it was 84, a lot of US athletes were motivated to figure out some way to stay in the sport. Then, of course, you had Adidas and Puma
Yeah,
fighting, the brothers fighting each other. So those shoe contracts kind of went through the roof. And then this new, kid on the block, Nike, came into play. And you had the Olympics in LA. And you had these older athletes, relatively speaking, older athletes, who actually performed better because they, shockingly, they were actually 3 or 4 years older and stronger. And I think it really changed how he thought of sport and who he thought it was appropriate for. And there was quite a bit of money coming in, and there was still this amateur ideal. I'm going to say ideal, uh, but there was starting to be significant workarounds that were allowing athletes, and people were still getting paid under the table. It was just nobody was really looking that hard anymore. It was
In
in
the
nobody's
80s.
benefit.
So the lines were getting blurred in the 80s. And then was it 92 that officially athletes could be
I, I,
compensated as professional?
yeah, I think, let's see, about the time I, I think I started law school in 1987. And at that point, you still needed to have a trust. So any earnings that you made, you could put in your trust for future use. And so I still had that. But by the time I graduated, or around the time I graduated, that was gone.
Hmm.
So, I mean, like I said, they started to be workarounds in the 80s to allow people to make money, but you still couldn't say, like, there was still no, like, you couldn't go to a race and win like $10,000 prize money. Like, that just wasn't allowed.
That's not that much money for a national or international race by
Yeah,
anybody's standards today.
no,
It
yeah,
it has gotten better for athletes. There's still a progression that's being made for women versus men. We talked about uh, the valuations of professional women's teams. Yesterday,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
the LA women's soccer team just got the highest valuation in the league. Benefit to being in LA and a lot of media,
yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
endorsement deals you can get in a market with 10 million people in it. But um, I'm encouraged and happy for women that are playing in any sport these days versus 35 years ago when you
Yeah.
guys were still trailblazing in a lot of ways. Who was your first sponsor?
So Puma was our shoe sponsor at Stanford at the time. And so when I came out of Stanford, that was like a natural group for me to stay in. I don't think I probably was getting a little bit of money from them. I mean, like we're talking like maybe $300 a month, $400 a month. But I got other things, like I got a ticket to Europe. They paid my way to Europe. They paid me a stipend for every day that I was in Europe. Wasn't much, but for me, I mean, I needed every cent and I used it all. So it was great. And then I was without a sponsor, so that lasted for like 2 years, and that's when I got injured and I was sick, and I was no longer sponsored by them. So when I went to, I might have still gotten shoes from them. I honestly can't recall. But when I certainly did not have a contract, then I went to the Olympic trials in 1988.
Hmm.
So uh, I did get one later. I left with one, but I didn't go with one. And actually, it was my husband and a really good friend of mine that negotiated my contract with Nike at the time. And then I stayed with Nike for the rest of my career.
Did you like the Nike people in terms of the folks
I did.
in Oregon that you talked to and
Yeah, yeah.
interacted with?
I thought, and especially at the time, I mean, I feel like it was just the right place to be as a track athlete, and they just loved the sport so much. I mean, they were a track, they were a running company. Um, and it was just a really, um, there was just a great energy there. And I mean, it wasn't perfect, don't get me wrong. And there were a lot of things that were, um, uh, say a little sketch. I mean, I remember having a conversation once about why don't they use like the female athletes in advertisement, and they would be like, oh, you wouldn't sell stuff, like, it'd be too intimidating for the women that actually buy our product. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me.
Wow.
And yeah, and you think like using a model is better. And things like that, like just really having a hard time you know moving the needle in terms of how they really view their female athletes. I mean, we were definitely second class citizens, but I was just happy at that moment. I was happy to be a citizen, second class or not. And which sounds kind of bad, but I mean, this was all new too, right? We were like the first generation of people getting open contracts and things like that, and it was great. I mean, every week I got new gear, and I worked with people to make shoes for me, and I mean, it was great.
Yeah, that was exciting. And
Yeah.
relatively speaking, it was better than the 70s, for
Oh,
those of us that were, I'm
yeah.
talking to my athletic friends, women friends that I swam with in the 70s, and I just was not aware at all pre-Title IX. I had no idea
Yeah.
how hard it was to do what they were doing, and what I
Yeah.
was doing and what they were trying to do were very different, and I was not sensitive to it.
Yeah. I mean, and again, like I think you said, it's frustrating when we have like this very short memory. I'll even talk to female athletes and they'll say something negative about Title IX. And I'm like, you do understand, like when I was your age, there wasn't college athletics. There was no requirement that they offer sports in high school for women. Like everything you do is because of this. And there's just like, and there's like no real belief that it could be taken away.
Wow.
So, you know, they just assume like, well, it was always this way and it will always be this way. Clearly not. So it can be quite frustrating. But at the moment when I was in the moment, it was very exciting to be a part of like a new age, being part of something. We were part of a change, and it certainly wasn't as fast or as much or as, I'm not saying that I was just satisfied with the status quo at the time, but I was happy that the status quo was different than the status quo had been, 10 or 15 or even 5 years earlier.
Yeah.
And I took some risks to get it done. I mean, it wasn't without some cost to me to fight for certain things. Um, but I wouldn't have done it any other way.
So we talked about doping, we talked about sponsors. What about
Yeah.
really briefly nutrition, diet? In the 80s, was it even something that was on the radar? Were there supplements? Did you?
I mean, it's very different now. Although it is different and it's not different. Uh, I still think we're a long ways from, how do I want to say this? I don't really, I think, uh, I think the biggest thing I learned as an athlete then, is that we really were focused on it, honestly, as a, like, we were obsessed in some respects with diet and trying to maximize our health and our fitness. And I think, and there was certainly this idea with American women in particular that, for distance running, the thinner, maybe not the thinner the better, but clearly, like, in order to be successful, you need to be lean. And, it led to, a huge amount of eating disorders, and it still exists today, but it was, I think, I won't say it was more prevalent, but there was less concern, if that makes sense, right? Like, you know, if you were anorexic but won a national championship, was that a problem? Kind of almost approach to it. I don't think that's the case anymore, right? Whether it's because you realize because either the science is better, in other words, if a woman or man for that matter is anorexic, their bone density is going to be poor, and if their bone density is poor, it's going to lead to injuries, and ultimately they're not going to be successful. So, I mean, even being like very almost caustic about it, you don't have to be altruistic to understand that it's not in your long-term interest as a coach or an athlete to be too skinny, right? Like that's a problem. Um, but that was almost the universal message that was sent. Like, yes, you don't want to have an eating disorder, but you want to be really thin. And then I went to Europe for the first time, and I was getting my butt kicked by women who weren't really skinny. They were strong and muscular, and they ate kind of whatever they wanted to eat. I mean, they were just going because we would eat together. I mean, I was funny. I finally started watching Sprint on Netflix. And I mean, some of the things are different, like it's definitely more glamorous, but a lot of it's the same. You show up at the hotel, the meals are still provided in the hotel. You all, your biggest competitors are sitting at your table or maybe across the table from you, or maybe, one, everything you're with them all the time. So that's all true. And you would be sitting with, you couldn't help but watch. You'd be sitting at dinner with your competitors. And it was just such an eye-opening experience for me, because for the most part, that was not like the Europeans, Soviets, whatever, they were not trying to be as skinny as possible. They were trying to be as strong as possible. And you just didn't see very many anorexic girls that were not American. And honestly, you get to the US, you get into the international competition, and American women just were not doing that well. I mean, Mary had obviously done well in the early 80s, but really had been riddled with injury ever since. And I mean, there's just a handful of people that competed on the international circuit that were competing in the, distance races that were American. I mean, there was only a couple besides me. And so I think you almost have to check a lot of things at the door. Like you can't be as, when you're traveling, there's just always unknowns, right? Like you don't know what your hotel room is going to be like. You don't know what food they're going to feed you. You don't know, like your flights, you're always on flights. Sometimes you're on charters, but a lot of times you're at the mercy of commercial airlines. You have to be able to go with the flow. And I felt like our system here, it was all about controlling everything and as much as you could. And if that was what made you good, if that made you good, when you got to Europe, or you got to international competition, you're probably gonna not be able to adjust. And the other thing that happened was I started to go, I would hang out with some of our best athletes in the world, and I would go, not me. This was never something that I enjoyed then or now, but we'd land in, Stockholm, and I would be with like a group of sprinters, and the first thing they'd want to do is go to McDonald's, you know, and we'd go to McDonald's. I would just hang out with them because it was something to do, but that was normal, and they were setting world records. So, it really was kind of an eye-opening experience for me when I first got there. Was like, yeah, nutrition is really important. Don't get me wrong. And I think it's more important today because more people have more information. And so, whatever you can do to shave off those tenths to seconds or seconds, whatever, great. But there's, our body is really adaptable in many ways. And we still don't really know what is like the perfect diet. We really don't know. And people can say they do, but we don't. We can't do double blind studies. We can't do like the kind of things that, particularly when it comes to the world of elite athletes. And so, obviously we know what extremes, right? Like, but really when you're trying to get to the, that middle ground, like it's very, very hard, and your body will make up for a lot of things that you do wrong in different ways.
Those are great insights and things that are not necessarily, they're counterintuitive, going and watching somebody eat heavy foods, whatever, and yet they can perform in your events in the middle distance, or doesn't seem to bother them at all. Fast forward to the kids that you're coaching, that you've been coaching at the college level right up until this year. Do you have oversight on their diet at all?
No, I mean, there's some real strict lines now in most college programs between what coaches can say to their athletes about anything about diet, weight, overall health. Like we really are not, for the most part, we're not allowed to say anything. Probably. It's a cause of frustration because obviously there are times when an athlete is not treating themselves as well as they should. And if you're out of school with a lot of resources and maybe you can direct them to a nutritionist or psychologist or whatever, you have that, but a lot of schools obviously don't have those kind of resources. And so you're kind of caught between you're just in a tough spot as a coach when an athlete needs help and you're not really allowed to give it to them. But that's kind of where we are. I mean, at one point, obviously the coach was the authoritarian figure on everything. And, in some ways, I wouldn't say we're all the way over here by any means, but we've definitely maybe overcorrected a little bit with our fear of creating an environment that will lead to eating disorders. Um, but it's a real fear. I mean, it's a real concern. I mean, there's a reason why they don't want coaches talking about it. Um, but it kind of puts health and diet into this kind of strange category.
Mm.
And um, it would be, I think, better for everybody if we could find a way to be conscientious without being obsessive.
Yeah, I didn't have this thing I'm thinking of planned for our interview. I don't want to go into it because it's daunting what you're making me think about as an athlete and a parent of athletes, college athletes myself. But of course, the issue of diet and being a student athlete, and then things like mental health and depression. And I don't want to go off on that because that's a serious topic in
Yeah,
and of
yeah,
itself.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't,
yeah,
but you've made me think about that, and that's very real. The pressure
yeah,
that kids feel
absolutely.
to perform on the track and in the classroom, and what that can lead to, especially when their diet gets out of whack, or there's
Yeah,
it's just it's hard to be a Division I athlete, to do
yeah,
well in school and play anything that takes 20 hours a week or more.
or more. Yeah,
That's just a tough act.
it is. And I think, I mean, I do think that's true. But I also feel like there's a lot of pressure to be successful in other ways as well, like with social media and things like that. It's not just, I mean, honestly, I don't think it's that hard to be successful in the classroom and in athletics, but it's usually not just that. I mean, it's obviously hard, don't get me wrong, but what makes it hard is when you look at your phone and somebody's, not, you don't like the way you look, or someone doesn't like the way you
Yeah,
look, or they're criticizing how you played, or you go on some, for us, like the kids love to follow Let's Run. I don't know why, but it's a terrible gossip site. But you know, um, I mean, it's fun if you can kind of rise above, but these kids get just drawn into it. And then they're also expected to, look great, and they're expected to do other things, and, be present, and maybe get
yeah,
involved in this activity. So, yeah, I mean, the actual classroom, and they can, I mean, most kids were very successful at doing those kinds of things in high school. And honestly, for a lot of kids, the shift is not that great. In other words, if you were a high school, my experience was, if you were a serious high school athlete, not someone that just kind of like did it for fun, but if you were a committed athlete in high school and now you're in college, a lot of times being a collegiate athlete is an easier transition because um, it's what you've known and you stay out of trouble,
yeah,
right? Like, generally from like, you know, 2 to 5 in the afternoon is not the time that you're probably going to go back to your room and take a nap, or, whatever. I don't know. So, that pattern that you've had in your life for so long can carry over. But it seems that also when you get to college, you're also expected to have like this incredible social life. And you're supposed to, like now you have to be like, if you're an elite athlete, you're supposed to like get NIL deals. And then you have that commitment, right? I mean, it piles on. It's not just
yeah.
about showing up at practice. There's just so much more. And
So
that
true.
I think that is what's, I think, really challenging today, is that
You're
you're not just measuring against yourself. You have this whole world that's measuring you as well. And it's a shame, honestly. It's really a
Yeah.
shame.
And you had a brand. We were joking about it. Your
Yeah, yeah,
around your pigtail. But I read some of the old write-ups and things, and they were even 35 years ago, you weren't wearing makeup, and yet they were objectifying in a positive way, talking about you as sort
yeah.
of a sex symbol for being a runner,
Look at me. Yeah,
and now it's like when I
yeah,
see the women get on the track or on the volleyball
yeah,
court or whatever, and they're made up, and they're still supposed to perform at a high level, but
yeah,
having to worry about things like that
yeah.
because
And I mean, again, for some people that's fun and a positive thing, but for others it starts to feel like, and also what if, I mean, I'm all for like, being who you want to be out on the track, right? Like, or wherever, like be you. That's great. And if you love that moment, if you love that, I mean, I remember when we had an athlete on our team who is now I think she's ranked number 3 in the world right now in the 400 meters, and she was almost missed her prelims because she was like putting on at NCAA regionals because she had to look right. But for her, it was actually like I mean, she had underestimated how far it was from our team tent to the starting line, so that was the bigger problem. But she's like, I can't go out there without looking good. And for her, it was part of her whole process,
A
and she
ritual.
enjoyed it. Her ritual, exactly. Um, but yeah, I think I just think there's a lot more. I think, we've talked about this a little bit, but, and we could, I mean, people talk about it a lot, but I mean, social media changes everything. And it just makes, it just raises the notch. It also means that you're capable of also generating. In other words, I feel like if I had been an athlete, let's say I was exactly the same level of athlete now, as I was then, I would have had a ton of pressure on me to generate a lot of social media because you can make a lot of money doing it. And so it would have felt like it's not just about how many likes you get. Now there's money. And so if you can get 1 million followers or 500,000 followers or 5 million followers, all of a sudden, that's a game changer for life.
Yeah.
But God, what a pressure, like I would have hated it. I would have felt conflicted all the time. I remember one time after I had gotten a lot of coverage for, I think it was World Championships or something. And I was driving, I had a little convertible at the time. And I was driving over to like the Stanford Mall to pick up something. I don't even know what. And I noticed all these people like looking back. And I was like, what? Like, what's going on? Like I felt like there was like, maybe there was like a fire truck behind me. I don't know. Like I thought maybe there was, and then all of a sudden at some point I realized that they were looking at me and I was like horrified because I thought like, oh, do I look okay? I mean, like, you know, that classic, was I
Amazing.
picking yeah, and I think, how would I feel now if like everything I could do could be captured on phone and then reposted later? I mean, I just would have died. I would have just not been able to live. And so, we all joke about that. Our generation will joke about like, thank God they didn't have phones back when, we'd all be fill in the blank. But it's true.
And
You can't make a misstep because it can be caught on camera, and then you have to explain your behavior of something that was, done in the privacy of your home, but there is no privacy.
And this subject alone is something for everybody that listens to this to think about, along with the 2024 Olympics, as you're watching the games and the athletes. How
Yeah.
has everything been altered in what we're seeing and hearing, via social media, in addition to NBC and the official broadcasts? And um, it's just we're not going back either. It's a different world.
No,
And
no.
so last 3 questions: your best moment and your worst moment as not just an Olympian, but an elite level athlete, runner in your
Mm,
case. Your best moment, your worst moment, and one Olympic relationship that was meaningful to you, a person that you competed against or was on the team with you, and or you've kept up with them.
yeah. Um, okay. I would say, I don't know if I can just, I have a lot of moments that I just look back on. I'm like, that moment. Or, um, winning the national championships in my last collegiate race is like crazy, like fantastic moment. And I did it easily at Old Hayward Field with a huge crowd cheering me on. Like, that was incredible. Um, and then, making the Olympic team the first time was pretty spectacular. I even, again, pre internet, and so I wasn't even 100% sure that I had made the team. Um, so, just to take a step back, I had been injured. I had run really well, in the mid 80s, and then I'd gotten injured, and I was just starting to come back. But at this point, I was like broke, and I was in law school, and I was, there's a whole story there, but I was basically working, training, and in law school all at the same time. And I was an RA, which, is also work, but, and I just found myself not having enough hours in the day. And my solution, very bad idea, was just keep setting the clock a little bit earlier in the morning so that I would, wake up, study, and then get, started with the day. But I wouldn't go to bed any earlier, right? So I was sleeping maybe 4 or 5 hours a night, just trying to get everything in. And I ended up getting really, really sick in December of 87 and ended up in the hospital with a very severe case of pneumonia. And not to be melodramatic, but it was life threatening. It was bad. And I've had pneumonia many times in my life. But generally the kind, you hear about, like the walking pneumonia or the community, this was bad. And I actually thought that I was done. I mean, I just thought there's no way now. I haven't really competed in a year and a half at this point. How am I going to be ready for the Olympic trials? And my coach even came to the hospital and talked about how, and he hated hospitals, which both scared me that he was there, because I thought, oh, I must really be sick if he's here. But I honestly don't remember the conversation. I was just like, remember going, okay, whatever, okay. And but he mapped out the strategy of how we were going to make the Olympic team. And we went, and I mean, by the when I got out of the hospital, I couldn't even run 10 minutes. I'm not joking. Like literally could not run 10 minutes. But I started, with 10 minutes, and I had to stop and walk, and it extended until finally I was at a point where I was running about 30 miles. No, let's see, probably about 30 to 40 minutes a day. And then I got sick again. And this was now February. And I knew I was done. And I went into my coach's office to tell him that I just couldn't, that I was sick and I couldn't keep going. And one thing with my coach is you didn't start talking until he looked at you. And he was writing all this stuff down on a calendar. And so I waited until he was ready. And he looked up and he said, "What does this say?" And I said, "I just wanted to let you know that I have like another case of pneumonia. And it's not as bad," I said, "but I mean, I'm not able to really start. I have to back off training again." And he just starts writing, and he turns around the calendar and he shows me how we're going to make the team. And he had, like, March was the fudge month, so it didn't really matter in his mind if we were not training in March. And it was April, May, June that was really important. And he explained the whole thing. He told me the race strategy that we were going to employ. He said we don't have time to train all different for all scenarios, so we're going to pick the one that's most likely. This is what I think is going to happen. I think Mary's going to take it out. You're going to have to go with her to separate the field. She's going to go out in about 4:45 for the mile. There's going to be some upstart collegiate hotshot that's going to try to go with her. That's fine. We only need one spot. This is the only time you're ever going to race where we don't care if you get first, second, or third. And then it's going to come down to a kick, and nobody can outkick you. And that was in February of 1988.
Oh
and
my
I remember
God.
and I remember I got back to I called my boyfriend at the time, who was now my husband, and he's like, "How did it go? What did he say when you told him?" And I was like, I didn't tell him. He goes, "What do you mean you didn't tell him?" I was like, "It's just easier to go along with him." I was so afraid to tell them that I quit that I figured I would just basically, I don't know, just keep going until it was obvious that it wouldn't work. And as you know, because you watched the race, that's what every single time I raced, the only thing I had to do was to go out. I mean, once we got to about June, it was, you need to go out in 4:45. I mean, the first one went on 4:45. I probably ran I don't even know. I mean, I went from being probably third or fourth in the field to being like dead last. People would just like fly by me. I mean, I was hanging on just by a thread. And I remember going to a meet about 3 weeks before the trials, or maybe it was 2 weeks before the trials. And I was sitting with the meet director. It's the Prefontaine meet actually. And I was sitting with the meet director and a guy from Nike, a couple of agents, just people that I knew through the sport. And they were talking about who was going to make the team in the 3K. And I was not even in the conversation. And I was so not even in the conversation that they didn't even feel obliged to say, like, no offense, PattiSue, but you've been sick, or no offense, PattiSue. I mean, it was like they didn't even think I'd be offended because I was so not in the conversation about who would make the team. But each time I did that race plan, I got a little farther, right? Like the first time I died after the mile, the next time I didn't die until like lap 6, and then it was lap 7, and then it was, I couldn't kick, but I didn't die.
Yeah.
And so now it was, race day, and felt great in the prelims and made it had my fastest 200s ever the week of. I knew I could outkick anybody. And the race went, as you know, exactly like my coach predicted, like exactly. And so when I really feel like I remember thinking, with 800 to go, I'm like with the two girls Mary, I think it was Mary Nisley who was supposed to be third on, the predicted third place finisher. And I think it was about 2 laps to go. I'm sort of hanging on to them. But usually, or maybe I was in front and they passed me. But either way, I remember I think Mary Nisley, not Mary Slaney, she was way in front, kind of like panicked a little bit that she didn't drop me, because all season long I'd just been gone at that point. And I remember each part of that race. I remember with 300 to go. Oh, I've done so many 300s. I'm prepared for this. And I remember with 200 to go, I was on the outside and Sabrina Dornhofer was on the inside. It was now down to the two of us. And, I was hanging on, but also I still knew I had another gear at least. And I also knew that she wasn't pulling away from me because she was on the inside. And so I was actually running slightly farther than she was. And we were staying like neck and neck. So I thought, even if I don't have the next gear, unless she does, I'm okay. And then I remember, most of the race I don't remember, to be honest. Like these are like flashes. And then we're coming around the turn and just thinking like, just be patient, be patient. And I remember hearing this huge roar, and I'm not aware of why there was this huge roar. And then I finally realized that they were cheering for us. But I think I realized that later. And so, they had one more gear that I was just waiting for like the right time to go and not to go too soon. And then that was it. I had nothing left. It was 100 and I think 16 degrees on the track or something ridiculous like that. We made the argument that they should move it. NBC was NBC, ABC, somebody was broadcasting it. They're like, well, you can't, it's still within the safe zone. All I know is, I was off the track with IVs in my arms in about a half a second. And an hour later, I never even knew. I was not aware that Sabrina had fallen. I was not aware that, that she basically literally crawled across the finish line. And that, if you talk to her, she'd be like, I tried to do one more gear and I had nothing left. And even the next day, then I was afraid to ask anybody if I'd actually made the team, because I thought maybe I'd fantasized it, right? Like I was hallucinating because of the heat and my fatigue. And I thought, what if I thought I crossed the finish line, but I actually hadn't? So somebody finally gave me like the paper results, because no phones to look at. And then I saw that I had actually for sure made the team. But even the next morning, I waited until I looked at the paper, because I was like, well, let me just see. I didn't even, I was like, I have to look at the paper before I'm really sure that I made it.
What a wonderful moment.
So that was, probably just because it was such winning the Olympic trials, 4 years later was obviously fantastic, but I shouldn't say I knew I was going to win, but I was the favorite at that point. And I knew I was a favorite by quite a bit. So winning was great. It was a huge moment for me, but, and it was kind of like, I can't believe I just won the Olympic trials, but also that I was prepared for. I was not really prepared. I really had no business making an Olympic team in 1988.
That was 5 months from the pneumonia diagnosis, maybe the conversation with your coach to the trials, right? Just for people that are listening, couldn't be more than five
Yeah,
months. That was February.
it was. Yeah, I had a
Games,
relapse. Yeah, and the Olympic trials, the finals were July 17th, and just
yeah.
totally coincidentally, July 17th, 1988 was the finals, and my younger daughter was born July 17th, 1998. But that was like totally like I didn't even realize that until years later when I was like looking at up something, and I was like, wait, actually, it was she figured it out. She was looking at some of the old like paper, some old like clippings and stuff. She's like, Mom, did you know? And I was like, no. She's
That
like,
is
yeah,
so funny.
yeah.
Um, and
So,
that 88 story though, I just again for anybody that's going to listen to your share, um, that counts themselves out, out of the game, outside the margin of being able to compete and succeed. Your story, I've read enough stories now. There are a lot of Olympians that had a similar diagnosis, set of
mhm,
facts just months before the games, a serious
yeah,
injury, something goes wrong, autoimmune, and the next thing you know, they make their team, they make it into the finals of their event, and or maybe they medal even, in spite of a huge handicap, a setback.
yeah.
That's really inspiring for all of us
I
average people.
I do think. I mean, I think as a coach, I mean, you hear it as an athlete, but I think as a coach, even like when I remember like helping kids like be recruited in college or and they'll talk about the adversity they've overcome, and I'm like, no, if you want to be great, that's just part of the game. Like it's a given that you've had to overcome something. Like that is what greatness is. Like you're not going to be a great athlete without overcoming something. There's no straight line to success. And success, I mean, we hear this all the time, but it's just so true. And success is not linear. And I think that is, I mean, always, I mean, there's a flip, plus and minus to like social media, and that, we're always showing the glory. And every now and then people say like, oh, I didn't make the team, or, oh, this happened. But, um, you know, some of the greatest things came out of like the worst situations. I mean, um, I tell the story. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's not my story to tell, but Michael Johnson, was talking about retiring the 400, 200, 400 meter, former American record holder, was talking about retiring from uh, after the 1992 Olympics. And then he got food poisoning or got sick or got the flu during 92. And so decided that he didn't want to go out on that note, and then ends up coming back in 96 and having, you know, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest, certainly
400.
since Carl, yeah, certainly one of the only person I think to win a 200 and 400 gold medal in one Olympics. I mean,
And he's separated in the 400.
yeah, I mean, but he was almost done. So had this terrible thing not happen to him in 1992, which I'm sure at the time it was like, I can't believe this is happening to me. Would never have happened. I mean, maybe he would have come back and maybe he would have done the same, but you know, he was really kind of, I mean, it's a very hard life. And even the best athletes, I mean, especially then, didn't make a ton of money. I mean, you made a lot if you were like Carl, or I'm sure Mike and a few others, but we make good money if you were elite, but it's nothing like you think of today. And, and they would, so, and you're just on the road all the time and you don't necessarily have the best. I mean, it's just hard. It's very hard. And so I know that he had talked about like that. This might be it in '92. And I always wonder, like, if he had the Olympics he thought he was going to have in '92, would he have come back in '96?
So
So I mean, that is. I mean, my story is mini great. I mean, getting third place in 3K in 1998. I mean, for the outside world, it's like, okay, well, that's kind of cool, but it's not really like greatness. But for me, like that's was a moment for me that I just never really thought was possible. And as we were talking about yesterday, something I've been thinking about since I was, you know, elementary school, barely.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so um, but I think that's the thing. I mean, is that nobody goes 4 years of college and has no setbacks. I mean, nobody is on an Olympic team without setbacks. I mean, nobody. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
Um, I mean, you can look at, everybody that's in a practice. I'm sure. I mean, I haven't done the research. I can't say for sure, but I'm going to look at pretty much everybody, and you pay at some point, right? I mean, I probably the person that might, if you had looked in 2020, you could say that, or 2021, a thing moo, was unbeatable, and had that linear success, like literally didn't lose anything. But you know, it catches up, right? Like I don't mean to say that she's like, it's just that's life, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just life. And so we have to be able to deal with the setbacks in order to achieve. You're not going to achieve what you're capable of achieving if you can't deal with setbacks that are part of our sport and part of life.
So really that one story was the one story of you making the 88 games. In that one story, there's really one of your lowest moments, getting
Yeah,
pneumonia a second time in a short
yeah,
period of time, and
yeah,
really thinking with the runway that you had to the games at that
yeah,
point,
yeah,
this is all the years I've dreamed about this, going back to little girl 1968.
yeah,
It's not in the cards. And
yeah,
then it was in the cards a
yeah,
short period of time thereafter, with big thanks to your coach, who
yeah,
again, great coach, believes we can do things we didn't even think we can do.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
talk about one Olympic relationship. We'll wrap up on that. There's many, I'm
Uh,
sure, but let's just pick one person that became meaningful to you.
oh, that's a really good question. I mean, there were certainly a lot of people at the time. Again, for you youngins out there, it wasn't so easy to stay in touch with people back then. We were moving a ton. No, a lot of people, no internet, no emails, no texting. So, and a lot of people didn't even have like stable addresses, right? Like you'd have an address for 6 months, or you'd be staying with people because either you couldn't afford rent, or you're only someplace for 2 or 3 months before you'd move someplace else to work with a different coach or travel. So a lot of these relationships were super intense and very close. Like Sabrina is one of those people. I mean, we spent a lot of time together on the road, but I honestly haven't talked to her in 30 years. I know she's a
Wow.
doctor and it makes me sad, but it's also like part of life. Um, I would say of the people, I mean, there's a lot of people that I've stayed in touch with, though. I mean, particularly those people that are in the coaching world. Um, I would say that probably God, that's a hard one. I would say that my closest friend from the Olympic experience is, and this is the person I think you should talk to, is Sandra Farmer Patrick. And um, I mean, we were close because we competed at the same time, and I don't know, we just were, we were close, but we weren't in the same events, and um, but we just spent a lot of time together on the road and occasionally room together and that sort of thing. But also, I was really involved with USA Track and Field for a number of years after, well, even while I was competing and then after I was competing, and she was one of my little mentees, little. But now she's you know, the student becomes a teacher, so to speak. She's really now very much involved in USA Track and Field, and she's one of those people that you know uh, I've stayed in touch with, and I stayed in touch with anyway. But then when I was living in Austin for 5 years, we got to spend a lot of time together there, and that was great. Um, and she married another a fellow Olympian, um, and but there's just a lot of people, and some people that weren't. I mean, the thing about it is obviously like making the Olympic team is the highlight, the sort of like the pinnacle of the U.S. athletes, U.S. track and field athlete experience. But there's a whole world of like there's a whole circuit over in Europe and Japan, and so you can travel and spend a lot of time with people that were fourth at the Olympics trials, or would make an Olympic team anywhere else but not in the US. And I've said, a lot of those people are people that I call friends today too.
That's
So
fun. And that's
yeah,
fun. And that's one of the neat things about social media or the internet, or
yeah,
you can be
yeah,
connected to those people
yeah,
in other continents in real time and keep current on what's kind of happening in their lives. And
yeah,
I'm grateful for that. And Sandra Farmer, that's a familiar name. She's
yeah,
like you, stayed in the track and field world as a coach and kind of
yeah,
a senior person, uh, in terms of the U.S. Program as an
yeah,
administrator.
yeah, yeah. So she's great, and she has a really, really interesting story to tell about being about what happened to her in 1988, and then I mean, she had the lowest low, and I mean, again, her story to tell, but she kind of had it was pouring rain, and she was a 400-meter hurdler, and she had just decided to run. She's Jamaican by birth, I guess, and she had dual citizenship, and she had just decided to give up the citizenship for the U.S. and went to the Olympic trials. And because of the rain, they moved, they shifted all the lanes out. So because there was too much rain in lane one or too much water in lane one, but they kept the numbers the same. And so when she came off the turn, I'm going to say she was in lane five, but she had number four on her, like hip numbers were number four. And so she drifted into lane four, but she didn't cut anybody off. She didn't impede anybody. She was way far ahead of everybody else, and they DQ'd her.
No way.
And
Oh,
she was, I want to say, I mean, she was definitely an Olympic medalist. She had the Olympic medal potential at that point, and she couldn't compete for Jamaica now. And yeah, and so how you overcome that, right? Like how, I think she went on Oprah talking about it actually. But she
I'm going to
did,
take you up
she
on
did.
that. Follow up
Yeah,
with you later I
yeah,
would love to hear a story from her. Um,
yeah.
I'm so grateful for your story and for your willingness to share it with whoever the listeners are to this YouTube podcast. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Patty Sue. I wanted
Well,
to
thanks
ask
for reaching
you
out.
if it's okay to share some exciting new news about you and kind of the next chapter. It's
Yes,
official. Will you share
it's
that
official
with?
tomorrow. So by the time this comes on, it'll definitely be official.
You are
It'll be
going to
official.
be. You are the
Um,
new
uh, uh, Head cross country coach and assistant track coach at UCSB for men and
University
women.
of California, Santa Barbara.
Yes, yes. Super excited.
Congratulations.
So yeah, it's really good for me and my family, and I'm excited to be part of that program. So a
And
lot of
that will
history
be,
there.
just to clarify, men and women. You'll be coaching.
Yes. Yep.
Congratulations. That's
Thank you.
exciting.
It is.
And most people will still be hearing it here first if this uploaded in early August of 2024. So grateful for
Yeah.
you. And I'm very, very thankful that you made so much time for me, way more than I thought. And I hope that people appreciate getting a chance to hear your story and your reflections and your insights about being what it takes to be an elite athlete and ultimately participate in the Olympic Games. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.